Genesis 5, the passage that we read, traces the first generations from Adam to Noah. And in the list, we didn't read the complete list, but in the list, one man stands out because his life was a long walk with God, and he did not see death as his forefathers had. In every other thing, it would say he lived so many years and he died, but that's not the case with Enoch. Instead, Enoch was taken by God to be with him without enduring death. Enoch is actually mentioned in 3 passages, the 2 that we've just read, as well as in Jude. In Jude, we read that Enoch prophesied to God's coming judgment that would happen during the life of his great-grandson, Noah. And then there's a lot of other books and stories about Enoch prophesying. Those are a little more controversial, whether they're not included in our canon. You can explore those in your own time. But we do know that Enoch was one who was aware of judgment that was to come, and that he prophesied. But we don't know very much else about Enoch's life, what his work was, his job was, if he had one wife or more, the names of all of his children, or where he settled. We know that once sin had entered into creation, the world was no longer good. You remember that back in Genesis 1, God created, and he would say, "It's good." At the end, he said, "It was good." Now, it's no longer good. The people hated God, and we know that they didn't even believe that he existed. We know that relationships had broken down, violence prevailed, and that God was grieving for his creation. And we know that judgment was coming. But Enoch chose a different way of life, even with all that was happening around him. Most of us as followers of Jesus want to walk with God. We sing songs. Perhaps you picked up that theme this morning in the songs and choruses that we've read. Or maybe you remember that old song, "Just a Closer Walk with Thee. I'll be satisfied as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee." But we falter, and the walk is not always easy. And maybe like me, there are times on a walk that you wonder if it's worth it, you wonder if you're still walking with him, or maybe you've even strived to do it alone. The Camino is very much about a walk with others. There's a whole community of pilgrims around you. Now, everybody has different reasons of walking, and I wouldn't suggest that it's a walk that is necessarily for everyone walking with God. But the Camino is a time of really reflecting on the lessons of what a walk is all about. Walking with God, however, begins with faith. We read that in Hebrews. In Genesis 5, it tells us that Enoch chose to walk differently at the age of 65. I wonder how many of us here chose to live our lives differently, and it all began at the age of 65. For many of us, like myself, it began when we were a child. But how wonderful to make that decision of faith at 65. He chose to walk with God, and Enoch became a man of faith. And then in Hebrews, as I said, we read in Hebrews 11, by an act of faith, Enoch skipped death completely. We know on the basis of reliable testimony, but before he was taken, he pleased God. It's impossible to please God apart from faith. And why? Because anyone who wants to approach God must believe that he both exists and that he cares enough to respond to those who seek him. It's impossible to please God without faith. And Enoch became a walker with God, a friend of God because of faith. Enoch seems to have been a pretty ordinary man. Walking with God did not mean that Enoch separated himself from people. He didn't live that life of a mystical hermit, didn't go into a cave and separate himself from every community and spend his time in prayer only. He lived an active life, and we know that he lived in a life in a world that was messy. He lived in a world where there was evil. And we read that he had a family. It says many sons and daughters, and if you live for that many years, I'm sure you do have many sons and many daughters, far more than any that you and I may have. Enoch lived at a time when one generation lived so long that multiple generations overlapped, so that oral history must have been told while some could still tell the story in first person. Now, anybody who's a math, and maybe you'd like to even take this on as something to do this afternoon, you can try to figure out where the overlap was. Who was still alive when the next one was born, and who was still alive, and who was still alive, and go all the way down. It would be amazing because their generations were overlapping. My son sent to me a text this morning, and he said that my grandchildren, who are 8, 6, 4, and 2, while the girls, 8, 6, and 4, have been pretending all weekend to be families. They've been pretending to be moms. And in fact, they pretended last night that they were all going to bed pregnant with things stuffed into them. And so my granddaughter sent me, asked her dad, send Grandma the picture of me going to bed, pregnant. So I had to write back this morning, oh my goodness, it's wonderful that she wants to be a mom, but she's too young to be a mom. She's just 8, and I'm way too young to be a great-grandmother. I wonder how fresh for Enoch the account of the garden, the eating of the fruit from the tree of good and evil, and sin entering the world. All those stories, Adam and Eve walking with God in the garden and having those wonderful conversations, those must have still been somewhat fresh when Enoch was still living. And then Enoch would have heard all the stories of how things turned in those early generations, how people wanted to be in control, how people wanted to have power, how they wanted to become gods themselves. And he would have already been aware of that sad slide to people no longer believing and no longer wanting to even follow God. But when Enoch became a father, the father of Methuselah, and that name will ring a bell to many of you as the man who lived so many years, when Enoch became the father of Methuselah, he had an encounter with God that convinced him that not only God was real, not only was God true, but that God longed for and wanted a relationship with his creation, a relationship with people, and not only that, that God wanted a relationship with him, Enoch. And so then we read that Enoch began walking from then on for 300 years. He put his faith in God. He trusted God. He chose to journey with God. And we read in Hebrews that Enoch pleased God. The starting point of Enoch's long walk was faith. He made a decision to live counterculture to the world around him. The evil, the chaos, the messiness was set aside, and he was going to choose to live as God had intended and desired. And he put his faith in God, in a God who was interested in walking with him. Now, Enoch would have learned about the importance of presenting offerings, and he would have been presenting offerings, I would imagine, as part of his worship. But his walk with God was not about religious practice. It was not about doing the right things. We can come to church regularly. We can do many good things. We might have a list of things that we don't engage in that the culture around us does. You remember years ago when people would say with pride, "I don't drink, cuss, smoke, or chew, or go with guys and girls who do." He might have even had that. We might imagine that because we're doing all the right things and we're separate, our lives are not the same as those around us, that is the same as faith. But faith as we see it in Enoch, and the faith we are called to live, is a faith that is based on a relationship with God himself. In the sending of his son, Jesus, we have a fuller revelation of God. We have even more evidence of how deep the love of God is for us, and all the more reason to place our faith in him. If you haven't put your faith in God, and you're interested this morning in learning more so that you can begin walking with God, there are so many of us here this morning who are available to talk with you, and we would love to introduce you to our friend who we've put faith in, who we walk with. So Enoch's walk began with a step of faith, but his relationship with God flourished into a friendship that was intimate and deep. Walking with someone can do that. Enoch became the father, as I said, at the age of 65, and with the birth of Methuselah, his life shifted in a significant way, because from that time on he was walking with God. So walking with God for 300 years, he must have learned so much about God. I think he began walking with God, and perhaps in those early years, he was still discovering who God was, what God was all about. But the longer he walked, the deeper that friendship became. Their friendship became so intimate and so real that instead of death by age or disease or accident or murder or violence, God took Enoch to be with him. Now there's one other man of God who escaped death and was whisked away to be with God, and that was Elijah. Elijah was taken to be with God in this chariot of fire and a whirlwind, and it was dramatic and chaos, and that kind of suited the character of Elijah. But Enoch went to be with God, and it was quieter. We don't know, and we're not told, if family were around and what family was around, but somebody must have been present to have recorded it, because they didn't spend years trying to search for where did Enoch go. Some writers have suggested that one day, after 365 years, Enoch and God were walking as usual, and then God turned to Enoch and said, "Instead of walking home today, why don't you come home with me?" Two friends carrying on walking into heaven. Now, when Dennis and I go walking together, whether it's a multi-day hike or a shorter walk on errands or along the Oshawa Creek near where we live, there are lots of times that we have just to chat and to share. Sometimes we're updating one another on the things that we're doing, or as Dennis might tell you, I'm letting him know plans that we now have for the days ahead that I've already planned out, and I am seeking his agreement, or else tasks that we'd like to do. And again, usually it's ideas that I have. Why don't we do this around the place? Then there are sometimes those times when our walking together is kind of a good opportunity to air out different opinions. Those moments when Dennis will say, well, I know you really want to do that, but do we have the budget? Really, should we do it? And we have these differing plans and opinions, and walking is a good time to sort things through. And then there are lots of times when we walk in comfortable silence. In between, I'm sure that there are times when Dennis will tell you when I am saying, these shoes are really not comfortable. I think I'm getting blisters. It really is too hot today. Those complaining times. But that's what friendship and walking together is about. Enoch and God were friends, and as friends, I think they just talked and chatted. Sometimes I am sure that it was a happy agreement between God and Enoch. I can imagine Enoch being interested in nature, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have God to tell you how it works, what the animal, what the bird is. At other times, I wouldn't be surprised that Enoch had witnessed an act of injustice or evil, and he would turn to question God, ask him, why didn't you step in? Perhaps like others of the people of God, he would cry to God questions of, how long must this go on? Why do you let those who are doing wrong benefit from their evil ways, while those who love you are always on the losing end? Friends are willing to challenge one another, and they want to talk things through. Enoch lived for 365 years. He would have experienced his share of sorrow and loss. Friends comfort one another. Enoch would have known God's comfort as he walked together. Friends praise one another when they work hard and they find success. And God was pleased with Enoch. And I can imagine that during a walk, God would have told Enoch how delighted he was in their friendship, in his faith, in his trust, and for Enoch's success. Enoch's relationship with God was real and intimate. Enoch's walk with God made every moment of the day sacred. Sometimes when I think of Enoch, I think of him like the character Tevye in The Fiddler on the Roof. It's an old movie, and I'm dating myself, but I'm not sure how many of you saw the 1971 movie adaptation of the stage production with the actor Topol playing the lead character of Tevye. Tevye is a milkman, and he speaks to God so naturally, whether it was in the middle of the night while doing chores, meeting with friends, or saying goodbye. And how often he looked heavenward and said, Lord, and went on with his requests, his questions, asking God to do something, or even sharing a laugh with God. Let me remind you of the scene just before If I Were a Rich Man. Tevye, a milkman, is tired. He's feeling a little defeated as he walks his horse home at the end of a bad day, a day when everything seems to have gone wrong. The horse has gone lame, and Tevye begins to talk to God. He complains a little bit, and then he says, Dear God, was that necessary? It is enough that you pick on me. What have you got against my horse? Sometimes I think when things are too quiet up there, you say to yourself, let's see what kind of mischief I can play on my friend Tevye. I'm not really complaining, With your help, God, I'm starving to death. So what would have been so terrible if I had a small fortune? If I were a rich man? And then he launches into the familiar song, If I Were a Rich Man. If you haven't seen the movie, I know none of this makes sense. Perhaps you could find the movie on YouTube or somewhere. Fiddler on the Roof. It's beautiful. But when I picture the depth of friendship Enoch had with God, I think it might have been along the lines of Tevye, a man who had a long friendship with God, and I think Enoch talked to God through every circumstance. Enoch did not have the good book that Tevye frequently referred to. We don't really know how God revealed himself to Enoch. But how blessed are you and I today? We have the scriptures. God reveals himself through the reading and study of his word. These are his words, his record. He not only reveals himself, but he speaks to us in ways that are hard for us to explain. How many times have you read a verse or a passage and it just feels timely? We also have the Holy Spirit that Jesus promised. Jesus promised the Holy Spirit, and when he was speaking with his disciples, he in fact said to them, I'm leaving you with a gift even better than me staying around. It's hard for us to even imagine. It would be nice for most of us this morning if we could speak to Jesus directly, and we think with the disciples, how could it be any better? But Jesus said, I'm leaving you the Holy Spirit, and actually, you're going to appreciate that even more than me being here with you. And in John 14, he said, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever. The Spirit of truth, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and remind you of everything that I've said. The Holy Spirit reminds us, teaches us, gives us the words we need, and strengthens us in our faith. Enoch's walk began with faith, developed into a deep, rich friendship with God, but throughout it all, it was maintained through commitment and obedience. There will be times on any walk, even the most pleasant and easy walk, where to keep going feels like a matter of simply putting one foot in front of the other. It takes commitment. And walking with God requires commitment and trusting obedience. The path becomes uneven. There is a long, steep hill to climb, and we are feeling weary. The weather's not cooperating. It's too hot or it's raining, and we're no longer happy walkers. And I think sometimes in our walk with God, those moments come. We're no longer happy in our walk with God. Enoch's walk with God was intimate. His relationship with God was a deep friendship. But Enoch still understood, as companionable as the relationship was, he was walking with God. He knew that this was a transcendent God, creator, powerful, completely beyond his understanding. Offerings, I believe, would still have been offered in reverence. He still understood that this companion walking with him was holy, and that demanded and meant commitment and obedience. Just as in the beginning friendship of Adam and God, Obedience was important and broken. Obedience is important for us to have an ongoing walk with God. And I doubt that Enoch ever forgot that he was walking with a God who was amazing and beyond him. This is a God who deserved Enoch's trust and obedience. As we walk with God, we should not forget that faith includes trust and obedience. Walking with God can begin with great enthusiasm, with the joy that we just feel is bursting out of us, but life can begin to take its toll. We become distracted by concerns, distracted by relationships. We feel perhaps that God is dragging his heels in answering our prayers. And sometimes we make our own decisions and we walk ahead of him. We wonder if he loves us. We wonder if he cares about us. Sometimes we may even wonder in our walk with God if he is listening to us. In our walk with God, we find our conversation, our prayer life strained. The good thing is that God does not respond in kind. He knows our makeup. He knows our frailty, and he's patient. He is the companion that walks with us, that waits for us. He continues to speak words of comfort. He continues to call us back into walking with him. I wonder if Enoch marveled with each year of walking with God. My mom, when she was celebrating her 95th birthday, I can remember her saying, I can't be 95, Julian. How did those years go? And I'm imagining that Enoch, with each year, said, isn't it amazing? We've walked together now for 200 years. We've walked together now. Is it 300 years? But if you asked him, I'm sure that Enoch may well have said, many days it was a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. I'm not skipping along every day. It's just plodding. But sometimes that's part of our walk. Sometimes the walk is light, and sometimes the walk is more of a plod. But Enoch must surely have learned the lessons of walking with God, involving trusting and obedience. Enoch's long walk with God, in a life that was trusting and obedient, had an impact on those around him. There were others who were watching. We don't know how many, and we can see by the time of the flood that there were not many. But Enoch's long walk of faith with God made a difference in Noah, his great-grandson. In Genesis 6, 8, and 9, we read, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God.